After producing my video on the date of Jesus' crucifixion, I realized that there were many Christians who believed that Jesus was crucified on a Wednesday. And since my earlier research indicated that Jesus could have died on a Wednesday, I wanted to delve into this topic a little more. Thus, this video goes into the controversy of the weekday of his crucifixion. For those already familiar with the issue, you could jump to the section on the empty tomb at about the 12-minute mark. For over 25 years, I have engaged in discussions in Christian apologetics with a focus on meticulous analysis. Similar to how a plowman removes obstacles from a field to improve agricultural conditions, my objective is to eliminate common challenges faced by Christians, therefore fostering a deeper faith in Christ. It is well known that the gospel accounts differ slightly concerning Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. These differences include: when was Jesus crucified? When were the spices bought? Who were the women at the tomb? And what time did the women visit the grave? Another issue is that many people do not understand the customs of Jesus' time, namely, when did the Jewish day begin and end? Therefore, I will open this video with a brief introduction into Jewish customs, then address each event from the four Gospels in a side-by-side comparison. Finally, I will present the four possible outcomes: a Friday crucifixion, two possible scenarios for a Wednesday crucifixion, and last, a Thursday crucifixion. The Hebrew term for day is yom, which was used by many different cultures. What causes some confusion is that the biblical term yom refers to both the 24-hour period and the daylight portion of that 24-hour period. However, it is critical to recognize that the darkness came first without any light. Then God created the light. He called the darkness night, while he called the light day. This period of light covered dawn, morning, cloud cover, eclipses, evening, and twilight. Anything less than total darkness was considered daylight. People often confuse the terms sunset and sunrise with the beginning and ending of the Jewish day, but these terms are not found in the creation story. Thus, they are not part of defining when the end of the day occurred. In Exodus, we find the Passover story. The first day of the Jewish year is the month of Nisan. On Nisan 10, they were to select a lamb for each family for the sacrifice. Then, on the 14th day, they were to sacrifice it at twilight. The Hebrew term used here is Hareb, which the dictionaries define as the period between sunset and dark. This means that the lamb was to be sacrificed before the last light of the day had ended. Later, in the darkness, God struck down all the firstborn of the Egyptians. This occurred at midnight, but its timing is not relevant here. Nowhere in Scripture is the Passover called a Sabbath. In fact, the term wasn't even used until Moses got the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. So scholars are conflicted whether the Passover was a Sabbath or not. I believe that it is, but it really does not matter, as the work that would occur on the Passover was explicitly permitted. The Feast of Unleavened Bread lasted from the 15th to the 21st. The 15th and the 21st were holy assemblies, which became known as the Sabbath. God specifically said that no work was to be done except for that which had to be eaten. This refutes many Christians who claim that Jesus could not have been crucified on the 15th, as it was a Sabbath, and the meals could not have been prepared. As seen here, God explicitly allowed for the preparation of meals. Yet, by Jesus' time, the Jewish people had modified the schedule. The Passover was on the 14th, immediately followed by the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Yet, both events were limited to unleavened bread. As a result, these two Sabbaths were merged into a single 8-day Sabbath from the 14th to the 21st. Thus, by Jesus' time, both holidays were referred as both the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Incidentally, we do a similar thing when we refer to the Christmas holidays, which include both Christmas and New Year's, which are 8 days apart. Next up is presenting every event of this controversy. I aim to show each event from all four Gospels. However, some passages were too lengthy for the space provided. Thus, I kept as much of each verse as possible while ensuring each account remained within its allotted space. The first event of the crucifixion was to establish the date. 3 of the 4 Gospels state it was on the first day of unleavened bread. 2 of them are more explicit, saying that it was the day the lamb was to be sacrificed. Thus, we know that the recorded events began on the 14th. John was more accurate because he states that it was before the actual holiday of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, indicating that it was Passover itself. From these accounts, we see that Jesus was outside of Jerusalem and he sent the disciples ahead. There, they brought the necessary supplies for the meal and prepared the room. But before the meal began, Jesus washed the disciples' feet. In this event, we see that they eat the Passover meal. Thus, it has become known as the Last Supper. After the meal, Jesus and his disciples left Jerusalem, traveled west through the Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives, finally settling in the Garden of Gethsemane. Then we see that the disciples sat down while Jesus went to pray. While Jesus was praying, the disciples fell asleep. From this, we can deduce it was the middle of the night. They were tired and fell asleep, as would be expected after a long day. This happened twice, but I only presented the first occurrence. Next, Jesus was arrested and taken to Caiaphas, the high priest that year. John was once again a little more explicit, stating that they took him to Ananias' house, where Caiaphas presumably lived. After this, we get our first clue as to the time of these events. Here, we see that it was early morning when he was taken to the Sanhedrin. In these passages, we find Jesus was questioned by Pilate, but we find in the book of John that it was before the Passover. How could Jesus have eaten the Passover, and yet the Sanhedrin would want to remain holy so that they could eat the Passover? As mentioned earlier, the Jews had combined the Sabbaths of Passover with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Jesus ate the Passover meal, while the priests were focused on the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Both events were referred to as Passover, which clarifies this reference. Here is the dilemma. The meal was scheduled for the 15th, while the feast was set for the 21st. Therefore, there are two possible conclusions. First, the chronology of the crucifixion might have been inaccurately recorded by the writers. Second, the priest might have observed the meal on the 16th instead of the 15th, adding a day of preparation in between. All that is known for certain is that the Gospels state that Jesus ate the Passover on the 15th, Jesus was arrested and crucified that same day, and the priest wanted to eat a Sabbath feast on the next day. Luke adds a detail that is not found in any other account. Pilate sent Jesus to Herod. This is important as there is a conflict about the hour of Jesus' crucifixion. Mark stated that it was at 9 a.m., while John stated it was at 12 p.m. How could Jesus be tried before Pilate, taken to Herod, then returned to Pilate for sentencing, whipped, and taken to Golgotha to be crucified, all in less than an hour? This is especially true when you consider that most government offices do not begin until 9 a.m. In my opinion, Mark was stating the time the trial began, not the actual crucifixion. Next, Pilate tried to release Jesus, but the crowd demanded Barabbas instead. Despite Herod finding no reason for Jesus' execution, the people insisted upon his crucifixion. There is a minor call-out here. The Greek text does not specify the term Passover, only at the feast. Matthew records an event not found in the other accounts, Pilate's wife's dream. This played an important role in my video that identified the actual Gregorian date of his crucifixion. Note that it occurs during the discussion of which criminal to be released. John records that Jesus was still on trial at 12 p.m. Just so everybody understands, the Jewish day was divided into two segments consisting of 12 hours each. These hours were not like our 60-minute hours, but 12 equal divisions throughout the period. Thus, when John said that it was about the 6th hour, that would equate to 6 hours after the start of the daylight period, which would be noon to us. The next scene was at Golgotha, where Jesus was crucified. All four accounts record that Jesus was crucified with two others, but some record the name of the place as Golgotha, and others record it as the place of his skull. Mark noted Jesus' crucifixion at the 3rd hour after dawn, which would be 9 a.m. for us. As mentioned earlier, Mark probably recorded the trial start time, not the actual crucifixion time, which would have been hours later. Each of the four Gospels was aimed at a specific audience. Matthew's audience was primarily Jewish, who would be familiar with the prophecies concerning the Messiah and anticipate their fulfillment. As such, he included the soldiers dividing Jesus' garments. The other Gospels do not mention this event because their intended audience differed. Mark showed that Jesus was a servant of the people, dying for their sins, while Luke was a meticulous historian. And John's purpose was to show that Jesus was the Son of God who could readily perform miracles. Thus, these latter three accounts did not see the need to mention this prophecy. The next event was the period of darkness between 12 p.m. and 3 p.m., followed by Jesus' death. There are two important aspects that are mentioned here. First is the period of darkness. It begs the question, if Jesus was crucified at 9 a.m., then why did the darkness only fall in the latter half of his suffering? But if Jesus was crucified at 12 p.m., then the entire time of his suffering was in darkness. This implies that Jesus was crucified at noon rather than 3 hours earlier. Another important fact is recorded in Luke, who explicitly stated that the darkness was due to the sun not shining. This is radically different from an eclipse because one can always see some part of the sun showing past the moon. Furthermore, eclipses don't last 3 hours. And Luke's description precludes the possibility of clouds covering the land. Therefore, any attempt to correlate this with an eclipse or other natural event is a distortion of Scripture. John records the priest requesting that Jesus' bones be broken because they did not want him to remain on the cross during a Sabbath. But there are two callouts here. First, it should be noted that it was a special Sabbath and not the weekly Sabbath. Second, I believe they made this request for two reasons. The first was the given reason. The second was that they knew the Messiah would not have his bones broken. Thus, if Jesus' legs were broken, then he could not have been the Messiah. Unfortunately for them, Jesus was already dead and the soldiers did not break his legs. All four accounts recorded that Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus' body in the evening hours, which means his request was just before the sunset, but the actual burial had to have been later. There are two key facts shown here. First, it was still the day of preparation, which meant that the darkness had not come over the land. Second, Luke records that it is a Sabbath, not the Sabbath. Mark's account appears to record that it was a weekly Sabbath, but a look at the Greek shows pro-Sabbaton, which means before Sabbath. This is yet another indication that it was not the weekly Sabbath. Then comes another controversial issue. Luke recorded that the women prepared spices on the day of preparation before resting on the Sabbath, but Mark recorded that they bought the spices after the Sabbath. I believe this was an error on Mark's part. Matthew records the sealing of the tomb. While this may not appear to be important, it is yet another critical event in the process. This is because the priest requested the tomb be guarded after the day of preparation, which means it was on the Sabbath, even though Matthew did not call it out as the Sabbath. They were so concerned about ensuring that Jesus could not fulfill the Messiah prophecies that they broke a Sabbath to make a request to Pilate. Can we say hypocritical? Now we are getting into the next area of conflict in the accounts. Because of the complexity of this issue, I will be breaking the passages in the four Gospels into smaller parts. Here, I am providing an overall context before I drill down into the details. To better understand when the women went to the tomb, we need to look at the Greek words rather than the translation. Much like the English terms man versus men, Greek words can change from the singular to the plural with a single letter change. I have translated the original Greek in a word-for-word translation. Let me preface this by saying that pure word-for-word translations do not always translate well. For example, the English phrase, your ball, would be translated as you ball, when it really means ball belonging to you. Thus, you will need to accept that my translation results will not always flow well. In Matthew, we find a keyword, Sabbatun, which is a plural form of Sabbaton. This indicates that more than a single Sabbath had passed, not just the single Sabbath that appears in the English translation. In Mark, Luke, and John, we see the similar wording. But am I mistranslating this? Let me back up slightly in the passage found in Luke. Just one verse before, the verse states that on the Sabbath they rested. Looking at the Greek here, we find that on the Sabbaton they rested, while after the Sabbatun they went to the tomb. Thus it is clear that they rested before a Sabbath, but waited for multiple Sabbaths to pass before going to the tomb. But who went to the tomb? Matthew states that Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to the tomb. Mark states that it was Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome went to the tomb. Luke gives us the best explanation later in verse 10, saying that it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary the mother of James. Also the other women with them went to the tomb. Thus, Luke clearly indicates that more than 3 women went to the tomb, but John only states that Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. Thus, the accounts do not disagree with the women's identities. The only differences were who the writer decided to name. The accounts also agree on the timing on when the women went to the tomb. The key point in these 4 accounts is that the tomb was empty when the women arrived. Neither Jesus nor the soldiers were present. This suggests that Jesus had risen and left the tomb, and the soldiers reported this to their authorities. The absence of the soldiers on the women's journey to the tomb provides insight into the time of Jesus' resurrection. It likely occurred during the night since neither Jesus nor the soldiers were seen by the women. The main point is that Jesus said he would rise within 3 days and 3 nights. Sunday after sunrise would have made it 4 days and 3 nights. There is some disagreement regarding when the spices were purchased. Mark says they bought them on their journey to the tomb, while Luke says they had bought them and prepared them on the preparation day, then brought them to the tomb after the Sabbath. But in my opinion, this disagreement is immaterial. All of the accounts state that Jesus rose from the grave, so there is not much to talk about here. Next up is the timing of Jesus' time in the grave. In Matthew, Jesus explicitly stated that he would be in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. Thus, all the accounts agree on the 3-day limit. This means that within 72 hours, Jesus had to rise from the grave to fulfill the prophecy. Let us consider this limit and the 3 proposed weekdays for him rising, Friday, Wednesday, and Thursday, to see how well they fit this limitation. I created a graphic which lays out the Jewish calendar, aligning it to today's Gregorian calendar and denoting the periods of darkness and daylight. I also created a graphic that depicts the 72-hour limit for Jesus to be in the grave, with a gray arrow indicating when he was buried and an orange arrow denoting when he rose from the grave. The agreed upon facts are that Jesus was buried before the night fell, and that he rose during the nighttime hours of the first day of the Jewish week. This could have been just after dark, or just before the darkness ended. In this example, it has been assumed that Jesus was crucified on Friday. There are only 2 days and 2 nights with Jesus in the grave. Thus, it does not match the facts seen in the accounts, nor were there at least 2 Sabbaths between his burial and the women going to the tomb. In these next 2 examples, it has been assumed that Jesus was crucified on a Wednesday. In the first case, Jesus was buried on a Wednesday evening, but he rose more than 72 hours later during the nighttime hours of Saturday, spanning 4 days and 4 nights. This means that the Jews would have dismissed the fulfillment of the prophecy on the grounds that Jesus did not rise within the 72 hours he prophesied. Thus, it does not match the facts seen in the accounts. In the second case, Jesus was in the grave for 4 days and 3 nights, but rose before the night time began. If that occurred, then his rising would have been on the Sabbath. It is also likely that the disciples would have known about his resurrection before the next morning. Thus, this scenario does not match the facts seen in the accounts either. In this example, it has been assumed that Jesus was crucified on a Thursday. Jesus was in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. Critics may claim that he was not in the grave for a full 72 hours, but it was impossible for Jesus to be in the grave for exactly 72 hours. Let me demonstrate this point. Our day goes from 12 a.m. to 11:59 p.m. If we were to measure exactly 72 hours starting from 12 a.m., then it would end at 11:59 p.m., not at 12 a.m., because that would be 72 hours and 1 minute. This means that Jesus could not have been buried at the same time he rose 72 hours later. At the very least, it would have to be 72 hours and 1 minute, but this exceeds the limit of the prophecy. Therefore, Jesus had to be in the grave for less than 72 hours. This scenario means that Passover occurred on a Wednesday, that Jesus ate the Passover meal on Wednesday night, and he was arrested, crucified, and buried on Thursday before the daylight passed. From this information, we see that Nisan 14 was on Wednesday, Preparation Day was on Thursday, Feast of Unleavened Bread was on Friday, and the weekly Sabbath on Saturday. This agrees with the Greek text concerning the number of Sabbath days that the women rested. The Sabbath's rest would have extended from Friday to Saturday, and this agrees with my earlier video that Jesus rose from the grave on April 15, 35 AD. But there are some unanswered questions. Why did the priest treat Friday as the day for the Passover feast? Was this feast shifted from the 15th or the 21st? Since they went to Pilate during this high Sabbath, why did the priest treat the high Sabbath with less regard than the weekly Sabbath? These questions cannot be answered. What is known is that the traditions given by Moses about 1400 years ago were not strictly followed. Why they were not followed is subject to debate. And this concludes today's video.